Going live.
Okay, so hi, my name is Sebastian Budin. I'm a founding member of Historical Materialism Journal and the book series and the conferences, some of which you will already be familiar with. So I wanted just to pitch to you the idea of you subscribing to the journal, firstly. The journal comes out 4 times a year, published by Brill, over 1,000 pages of extremely important and stimulating Marxist theory and Marxist history. We have a discount at the moment for individual subscribers around the time of the London conference, and we very strongly both request and demand that you subscribe to the journal, that you get other people to subscribe to the journal, and of course that you get your institution, if you're part of a university or other institution, to subscribe to the journal. We need more subscribers for this project to be able to expand and continue. The second thing I really wanted to push was the book series. The book series you also probably be familiar with. It's published by Brill Academic Press, and then the volumes come out 12 months later with Haymarket Books in Chicago, paperbacks. We have more than 200 volumes published now, of translations, of original work, of document collections, of translations from Marxist theory from across the world, from Japan to China to India to Latin America, very important Latin American list shaping up in the book series, and so on. It's a really crucial intervention in Marxist literature and in making Marxist theory.
Silence, s'il te plaît, maintenant, d'accord?
Really hasn't existed on this scale since the 1970s. So we'd like you to look at the book series, buy individual volumes, perhaps take up the offer of the book club that Haymarket is promoting. And also, of course, if you're part of an institution, to get your institution to buy as many volumes as possible. Those are the 2 key elements of our activity, aside from the conferences, the journal and the book series. And we think it would be, it's essential basically for us, for our existence, for us to be able to continue to thrive, for those to expand. So please subscribe to the journal, buy the books in the book series, publicize both around you, and help us build the Historical Materialism project. Thanks.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi, my name is Sebastian Budin. I am a member of the editorial board of Historical Materialism, and I am pleased to welcome you to this session. So the title of this session is Marxism and Gender, and we have 3 papers. One is a co-written paper. So the first paper is by Nuno Machado from University of Lisbon in Portugal. He works at he's a researcher at the SOCIUS Social Research Center, and he's working currently on a book on social form in Marxist Capital, which will be out in Portuguese. Then the second speaker, the title of Nuno's paper is Thinking the Two-Dimensional Woman, Capitalism and Domestic Labor in the Light of Robert Kurz's Writings. Then the second speaker is Jonas van Vossole from Coimbra University. He's based at the Center of Social Studies at Coimbra. He works on a number of different subjects: Marxism, democracy, political economy, racism in Europe, and so on. And the title of Jonas's paper is Luxembourg's Approach to imperialism as a perspective on nature, race, and gender. And then finally, we have a co-written paper by Satyaki Dasgupta, who is a PhD student at Colorado State University, and Annesha Mukherjee, who is at JNU, but also based in Kerala. And she's doing a PhD, I believe, in Kerala on women's work and agency, and she's working on labor economics and gender economics. And the title of their paper is A Marxist-Feminist Discussion on Female Labor Force Participation and Intra-Household Dynamics in Post-Pandemic India. So the format will be a pretty standard format. All the speakers will speak for around 20 minutes, and then we will have a question and answer session. As in previous sessions, you can type your question into the YouTube chat, and then I will read those questions out as long as they're not completely insane to the speakers and ask them to respond. Okay, so I hope that's all clear. And we go to Nuno Machado on thinking the two-dimensional woman, capitalism and domestic labor in light of Robert Kurz's writings.
Okay. Good afternoon to all, at least good afternoon when I'm speaking. So as Sebastian has mentioned, the title of my presentation is The Two-Dimensional Woman, Capitalism and Domestic Labor in Light of Robert Kurz's Writings. So without further ado, if I could, okay, the problem is I didn't, of course. Sorry for this slight delay. So, okay, first things first, who was Robert Kurz? Born in 1943 in Nuremberg and deceased in 2012 in the same city, Kurz was the major theoretician of the intellectual current known as the critique of value, Wertkritik, which arose in Germany in the mid-80s. This current seeks to reclaim the radical core of Marx's critique of political economy, namely his theories of value, fetishism, and crisis. Kurz places a great emphasis on value as a fetishistic universal form of wealth and social mediation. Through their alienated and socially syntactic collective practice, Marx's abstract labor, individuals constitute value as a social form, and this, in turn, is constitutive of the forms of subjectivity, action, and thought prevalent in modernity. As the unrelenting process of valorization of value, captured by its general formula MCM, that is, money, commodity, more money, capital is a temporally dynamic system based on the autotelic productive consumption of human labor power in order to accomplish the tautological transformation of €1 in 2, €2 in 3, etc. This transcendental or a prioristic principle violently subsumes sensuous reality and human beings, imposing on them, unconsciously, behind their backs, modes of being and action. The abstract logic of value represents, therefore, an impersonal form of domination, a totalitarian fetish constitution. Well, throughout the 1990s, Roswitha Scholes, another member of this intellectual current, will basically argue that Kurz's analysis, although essentially correct, only tells half of the story. Marx's critique of political economy is insufficient to fully explain capitalist modernity because it overlooks an absolutely nuclear category, asymmetrical gender relations. According to Scholes, a vast set of activities insusceptible of commodification, but crucial to the reproduction of capitalist society as a whole, were historically undervalued and delegated to women. The economy, as well as politics, connoted as masculine, both posits and presupposes a dissociated sphere understood as feminine. Robert Kurz is entirely convinced by Scholz's thesis and incorporates them in his own theory. Thus, in the beginning of the new millennium, the critique of value is reformulated and becomes explicitly a critique of value dissociation, Werkspaltungskritik. As I have mentioned in the introduction, from Robert Kurz's perspective, the modern fetish constitution does not encompass solely capital and socially synthetic abstract labor. Kurz acknowledges the relevance of Scholz's sexually informed theory of dissociation and adds the gender relation to the fundamental capitalist categories. Thus, contrary to the position of postmodern feminism, Kurz claims that gender is not simply a narrative or a signifier that can be deconstructed by a means of a discursive intervention, but rather a structure of domination with its own history. According to Kurz, the goal inherent to the value abstraction of completely subsuming the world of human beings and nature is unattainable. Therefore, the constitution of the modern disembedded economy was possible only through the simultaneous dissociation of several moments of life, material, psychosocial, and cultural symbolic, indispensable for social reproduction, but that are not representable in the form of value, nor apprehensible by the abstract time-saving efficiency of commodity production, that is, by the ever-growing normative standard of productivity dictated by socially necessary labor time. Time is money, as we all know. These moments that do not fit the homogenizing logic of money are structurally connoted as feminine and thus are historically delegated to women. Furthermore, since they are dissociated from the official sociability of value, they are defined as inferior and relegated to a marginal existence as the socially invisible presupposition or shade of capital. This socio-historical construction of femininity involves, therefore, the constitution of specific and clearly hierarchical sexual roles. On the one hand, man appears as the representative subject of abstract labor in the masculine economic domain of production and competition. On the other hand, woman becomes a domesticated natural being on which it is discharged everything that is excluded from that real social abstraction. The most salient manifestation of dissociation is the segregated familial sphere. This is the place of the so-called domestic labor, which comprises a set of daily activities foreign to the commodity form, but that prove to be indispensable for the reproduction of labor power, namely cooking, doing the laundry, ironing, cleaning, etc. Besides these concrete material tasks, women are often responsible for immaterial relations such as love and affective dedication. It is up to them to create a pleasant atmosphere at home, that is, a haven of intimacy where the competitive warrior may recover from the hardships endured in the capitalist public sphere. The same emotional dedication is applied to raising children and caring for the elderly, thus, to the reproduction of future labor power and to the relief of that labor power already beyond its expiration date. While it is undeniable that capitalism could never have functioned without this segregated social space, sexual dissociation does not refer solely to the domestic sphere of bourgeois privacy. It is a relation that actually cuts across all the domains or planes of modern society. Dissociation is the tacit presupposition of the capitalist mode of reproduction and, at the same time, its specific result. Accordingly, it is a determination of essence, a category pertaining to the totality, just like valorization and abstract labor. Following Scholz, Robert Kurz claims that value and dissociation are two sides of the same coin. That is, they represent to the same extent general structural principles which are co-constitutive of the a prioristic and overarching social matrix. In this sense, the fetish is not only value for itself, from which something is dissociated. Instead, both value and dissociation constitute together as the relation of value dissociation, the fetish specific to modernity. In sum, the system of the disembedded economy is simultaneously a system of sexual dissociation and vice versa. The androcentric value abstraction and the form of practice structurally connoted as masculine, abstract labor, on the one hand, and the remaining areas of everyday life and relationships, personal affection, feelings, etc., connoted as feminine, on the other, are mutually implied within a relation of reciprocal dependency. Only their contradictory unity allows the formation of a critical concept of modern society. The theory of value dissociation offers then a different conception of all, insofar as, faithful to its object, it argues that the negative universality of capital does not predispose a monistic totality, but a broken totality which in itself does not add up. In other words, the abstract universe of the commodity-producing economy is not a closed system, despite its totalitarianism, because the capital relation as a whole presents itself intrinsically fragmented by the relation of sexual dissociation, in the absence of which it cannot be grasped adequately. The modern a prioristic matrix is the dialectical unity of identity, value, and non-identity dissociation. One should keep in mind, moreover, that value dissociation, and not only the disembedded economic domain, constitutes the real historical presupposition of the subsequent functional differentiation of modernity in separate spheres such as politics, art, culture, etc. The a prioristic matrix of value dissociation predisposes the social forms of subjectivity and objectivity. In fact, the subject-object dichotomy typical of Enlightenment reflects an arrangement in sexual terms. Capitalism transformed the mass of men in identical monads who own their labor power. Since its historical inception, then, the subject form is connoted as masculine because of its close connection with the exercise of abstract labor. Furthermore, this economic subject, bourgeois, is the foundation of the legal subject, citoyen, and of the corresponding rights of men, and I emphasize men. Thus, the abstract, homogeneous, and apparently without qualities individual that prevails in modernity is, in reality, endowed with masculinity. The formal universality of the subject of value reveals itself to be inherently androcentric, that is, a subject is an actor structurally determined by the masculine gender. In turn, woman is degraded to an object, which is to say, constituted as a compensatory being or symmetrically inverted figure of the masculine subject of value. It is frequently confined to the private and familial sphere, and furthermore, allegedly natural attributes are imputed to her. While men end up reduced to the status of insensitive social machines as carriers of abstract labor and value, dissociation projects onto women a set of qualities that renders them hypersensitive beings. Robert Kurz sums up the question in the following quotation. She became responsible for everything he can no longer sense or enjoy. Feelings and affective dedication, the aesthetics of daily life and sensuality, trapped in the abstract privacy of the modernized nuclear family, which is like a maximum security prison. In this way, unpredictability and caprice, absence of concentration and self-control, voluptuousness and unrestrained sexuality were imputed to women. End of quotation. In this context, man establishes a contradictory love-hate relationship with women. On the one hand, he desires, covets, and longs for the sensible qualities of his other, which therefore must serve him like a domesticated natural entity. However, he simultaneously fears those qualities that became something strange to himself. He needs to repress them day after day, violating his senses, drives, and corporality, because they are a hindrance that compromises the self-control required to sell his labor power in the market, and above all, to introject the hard shell of abstraction and function as an animated robot in the process of production. The unconscious hatred that he feels for his situation, due to the violence he exerts over himself as a sensible human being, is frequently redirected to an external object, women. For example, after suffering the endless daily humiliations in the factory or in the office, a man arrives at home and unleashes his frustrations by harassing or beating his wife. Although I cannot elaborate this issue, the scenario gets worse as the contemporary crisis of abstract labor entails necessarily the crisis of modern masculinity and of the relation between the two sexes. The unsurprising result is the barbaric brutalization of patriarchy, since the masculine laboring self-image is menaced with extinction, but the patriarchal structures and hierarchies continue to hold sway. Finally, last slide. The large influx of women into the labor market throughout the 20th century does not contradict the relation of dissociation. First of all, within the economic sphere, they, that is the women, are forced to adopt the same psychosocial features historically ascribed to the masculine subject. Ruthless and aggressive behavior, as well as discipline, self-control, and emotional coldness are crucial to be professionally successful. As we all know, nice guys and girls finish last. Both in competition and in the process of production, women must act according to the presupposed androcentric form of social subjectivity, which is inherent to the value form. Small parentheses. Similarly, it is perfectly possible to find empirically some men involved in the dissociated moments of social reproduction, domestic labor, raising children, providing nursing care, social work, etc. Evidently, they are forced to adopt the feminine psychosocial features imputed by the overarching matrix of value dissociation while performing those roles. End of parentheses. Secondly, with the expansion of wage labor, a schizoid feminine figure has emerged, insofar as getting a job does not mean that women are exempted from the bulk of the activities and relations within the private domestic sphere through an equitable sharing of that burden with men. In fact, one is allowed to speak of a double socialization of women, which is at the same time a double shift. On the one hand, they endure, just like men, the same submission to the abstract labor fetish, while on the other hand, since the structure of dissociation remains intact, they are disproportionately responsible by the plethora of domestic activities and by the raising of small children. Indeed, only a minority of well-paid women, winners in the context of the competitive social appetite, are able to avoid that additional burden by delegating it to immigrant, Black, or underprivileged domestic servants. Thus, the existence of the overarching matrix of value dissociation means that the recognition of woman as subject in capitalist society must be kept imperfect and incomplete. According to Kurz, as a monetized subject, she is on the inside, but as a carrier of those dissociated moments and areas of life, she is on the outside of the official abstract sociability. Moreover, women are on average lower wages than men and rarely hold leadership positions. Those are the references. I put here a meme. I think I can read it. It's a steal from Wes Craven's Red Eye, in which Cillian Murphy's character says this to Rachel McAdams' character. Lisa, whatever female-driven, emotion-based dilemma you're dealing with right now, you have my sympathy. But for the sake of time and sanity, let's break this down into a little male-driven, fact-based logic. I think this illustrates dissociation perfectly, and with this, I end up my presentation.
Thank you very much, Nuno. The next paper is by Jonas van Vossole, and the title is Luxembourg's Approach to Imperialism as a Perspective on Nature, Race, and Gender. Jonas, you need to start again and unmute yourself.
Okay, sorry. Unfortunately, I didn't make a PowerPoint presentation like my other colleagues here, so you will just have my own voice and figure in this presentation. I think it's a theme that actually combines very well with Nuno's presentation, although it's a different influx, but I think we can have a nice discussion dialogue afterwards. So the title is Luxembourg's Approach of Imperialism as a Perspective on Nature, Race and Gender. And the presentation is a preliminary exercise of reflection that seeks to develop and systematize Luxembourg's approach of imperialism as a tool to understand the relation between capital, the state, and its boundaries. Since the dawn of capitalist modernity, the boundaries of civilization have often been considered as nature. Within the modernist perspective, nature always functions as the other, the non-human, or at least the non-social. Nature is thus opposed to society, natural sciences are opposed to social sciences, and the natural body is opposed to the human spirit. In most of modern political philosophy and social science, the state of nature functions as an abstract original position, a pre-civilized situation. The state of nature usually includes humans, but those humans have, those humans have a natural dimension, but without the state and the modern norms and institutions, these humans are projected nevertheless as uncivilized. The humans are often represented through stereotypes as barbarian, indigenous, non-evolved, without culture, or by contrast with an excess of culture. This is the state of nature of Hobbes, in which violence, the homo homini lupus, reigned. A state of nature which could only be saved through the modern state and the European enlightened colonizer. Just 1 second, because I cannot. The screens are going over each other. Such a perspective is only the ideological reflection of the capitalist political economy, which started to develop around the same time. Karl Marx, in his critique of the Gotha program, described how labor and nature are sources of value. It is, however, in the interest of capital to divide the categories of labor and nature in order for the accumulation process to be structured. In the critique of the Gotha program, he writes, nature is just as much a source of use values as labor, which itself is only the manifestation of the force of nature, human labor power. Insofar as man from the beginning behaves towards nature, the primary source of all instruments and subjects of labor, as an owner, treats her belonging to him, his labor becomes the source of use values, therefore also of wealth. The bourgeois have very sound grounds for falsely ascribing supernatural creative power to labor, since precisely from the fact that labor depends on the nature, it follows that man who possesses no other property than his labor power must, in all conditions of society and culture, be the slave of other men who have made themselves the owner of the material conditions of labor. He can only work with their permission, hence live only with their permission. The divide between nature and labor tends thus to reflect two different forms of accumulation of wealth upon which capitalism is based. In Capital, Marx described these forms respectively as expanded and primary accumulation. The normal process of capitalist accumulation is called expanded accumulation and seems a purely economic process. It's the transformation of C into C+, through the exploitation of labor. Money is transformed into capital when the initial amount of money is used to acquire production, a means of production, higher labor power, and eventually sell commodities through the circulation process. From the start, its goal is to eventually achieve a larger amount of money. To get this process started, however, an initial amount of capital is necessary. The process of acquiring this initial sum is what Marx calls the secret of primitive accumulation. It's a secret because it's something which is hidden in the logic of capital itself. According to Marx, such primitive accumulation was based upon the undisguised violence and bloodshed. In Capital, Marx writes, the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of indigenous populations of that continent, the beginnings of the conquest and plunder of India, the conversion of Africa in a preserve for the commercial hunting of blackskins, are all things that characterize the dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief moments of primitive accumulation. Marx, however, saw this process of primitive accumulation rather as an initial or primitive phase of capitalism. Rosa Luxemburg, in her The Accumulation of Capital and her analysis of the phenomenon of imperialism, upgraded the status of this so-called primitive accumulation. Rather than approaching primitive accumulation as a mere initial phase of the development of capitalism, Luxemburg's theory of imperialism assumed the primary accumulation as a continuing process. This form of violent accumulation happens not only before, but also parallel to expanded accumulation. Luxemburg arrived to this conclusion from the analysis of the phenomenon of imperialism. At the dawn of the 20th century, it became an ever more relevant phenomenon. The period was marked by the scramble for Africa since the Berlin Conference and would eventually lead to the First World War. Luxemburg explained the logic of imperialism by the ever-growing need of capital to find new resources in markets. Capital needed to overcome the inherent obstacles and contradictions in the normal accumulation process, particularly during crises when those contradictions emerged. Value is thus continuously extracted, both through exploitation and dispossession. The latter occurred in relation between capital and non-capitalist economies. As you all know, Lenin, inspired by Hilferding, defines imperialism as the stage of capitalist development in which financial capital took over control of the state. Its goal was to guarantee the accumulation process beyond its national borders. The state is the essential institution of imperialism. Its goal is to control non-conquered, wild, natural territories and resources. These include the scramble for its colonies, new trade routes, and the development of slave plantations. For Luxembourg, the phenomenon of imperialism is essentially linked to with reformism of the labor movement and the incorporation of this movement into the bourgeois state. Reformism guaranteed some economic advantages and limited political emancipation in the form of liberal democracy for the organized working class in the imperialist countries. It was particularly beneficial for the bureaucratic leadership and the labor aristocracy. At the same time, it made the working class complicit with the imperial phenomena of war and colonialism beyond its borders. In order to achieve social peace at the domestic front, the class conflict, expressed in declining exploitation rates, was literally exported to foreign affairs. Nationalism, chauvinism, and racism became important political devices to save capitalism. In Luxembourg, there is thus not only an essential economic, but also a political link between primitive accumulation and expanded accumulation, between the factor of labor and the factor of nature, as we will be defending further on. The phenomenon of primitive accumulation is, after all, not restricted to international relations. It happens in all new territories or scales capital enters. This includes non-conquered and wild territories and phenomena such as space, the Amazon, genetics, the internet, but more importantly for this discussion, feminine bodies and so-called uncivilized races and nations. Capital deals with identities and of gender and race in a similar way as it does to nature. In the historical development of bourgeois ideology, race and gender are literally naturalized. Within the framework of primary accumulation, racialized people are pushed towards the fringes of civilization and humanity. They are robbed of their history and rationality. Animalistic characteristics are attributed to them. In the same way, women have long been denied human rationality. Their essence has been restricted to their natural body. Their social role has been pushed towards the natural activities of reproduction. Over the last decades, various Marxist and post-Marxist authors have been inspired by Luxembourg. Her approach was applied to several of these natural fields, so-called natural fields. To name some examples, Maria Mies, Silvia Federici, and Stefania Barca have applied the idea of primary accumulation to the family economy and female bodies. Jason Moore has used it in the field of nature and climate. Nancy Fraser has focused on it in the debate with Dawson on the question of racial capitalism. Santos has developed the same logic in his paradigm of the abyssal line. The difference between feminine and racialized bodies and other natural phenomena is, of course, that these are never fully or only nature. Let us take, for example, the position of the black male worker in the United States. Until the abolishment of slavery, for capital, his existence was a purely natural resource. Its value was extracted through a legal system based on pure violence. For the female worker, the lived reality was even worse, as besides the extracted value of slave labor, she was reduced to a breeding machine of new slaves at the lowest possible cost. But the very possibility of understanding and organizing resistance to these inhumane living conditions by these violated subjects is what separates them from nature. It's their desire to change those things, the very essence of political praxis, which makes them ultimately human. In contrast to other nature, they have the potential to be labor as well. Since the abolishment of slavery, the black worker is confronted with both regulated labor and violent nature dimensions of his or her life. While his or her labor is paid in the labor market and can even over time have gained social and trade union rights, its value is kept low and super-exploitation occurs through the continued structural violence in other aspects of its life. Boaventura de Sousa Santos explained recently in one of his lectures on the abyssal line how a student living in a favela can have a decent formal status and working conditions, but when he quits the job and goes to the other side of the abyssal line, he crosses back into nature, going home, confronted with police brutal violence because of his skin color and the place he lives. The salaries of women are structurally kept low by their reproductive labor at home, the risk of domestic violence. They are confronted with their natural condition as they risk walking home alone at night. The nature-labor frontier crosses their reality at different aspects of their life depending upon the political power relations. None of the things described here is of course new to you, but in the end I believe that the perspective inspired by Luxemburg's theory of imperialism provides a very useful overall framework to understand many different phenomena. It provides an advantaged position to understand race and gender for several reasons. First, because it makes it possible to understand race and gender within a mechanism of commodity exchange and the capitalist political economy without abandoning the idea of class. And second, because it provides the political framework to articulate those political struggles. It provides a framework for labor, feminist and anti-racist struggles, not just to work together in accidental alliances or political articulations, like it is proposed in Chantal Mouffe and Laclau's work. It structures alliances through the form in which capitalist mode of production itself works. It is at the same time a critique of reformism. Thus, it is a critique of liberal feminism and post-colonialism, just like Luxemburg's imperialism theory was a critique of the reformist SPD. It assumes that any improvement of living positions of our social emancipation within capitalism eventually tends to provoke a strengthening of imperialist logics towards its borders and a further expansion of primitive accumulation in other spheres or markets. It is thus a call for revolution. Luxemburg viewed international solidarity and anti-imperialism as essential in the anti-capitalist struggle. She claimed that the responsibility for this lies in the strongest and organized workers' movements. In a similar way, it could be the primordial responsibility of the organized labor struggle for the emancipation of the subjects at a nature-labor border, while recognizing their own right to sovereignty in the struggles. It thus also provides a critique for the male chauvinist and racist tendencies in bureaucratized labor. Okay, thank you. That was my presentation. I hope we can have a nice discussion after.
Thank you very much, Jonas. So then we have our final paper by Satyaki Dasgupta and Annesha Mukherjee. And the title of the paper is A Marxist-Feminist Discussion on Female Labor Force Participation and Intra-Household Dynamics in Post-Pandemic India.
Yes, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are right now. And I'll just share the screen. So give me a minute. Yes. So Satyaki and I have written this paper. It's still a work in progress. So we really need suggestions on how to improve on our work. And what we do is basically, unlike the other two presentations that we saw right now, what we do is we apply the Marxist-Feminist debate on, not exactly the debate, the framework of the entire domestic labor on a female labor force participation in intra-household dynamics in the current situation, where not exactly in the post-pandemic situation, but we're still in the pandemic, but in the context of India, and which can be extended to other developing countries as well. So it is to be noted first that India has actually one of the lowest female labor force participation rates in the world, and over time it has been declining as well. And this is a bit puzzling because this has been observed in the face of high household incomes and high economic growth and higher educational attainment, lower fertility rates. So this has created a lot of debates among the scholars in India as to why is this happening. And much of these reasons can be actually traced to the patriarchal norms of the society, that if the spousal earnings are sufficient for the household, then there is no need, quote unquote, for the woman to work. And that discourages their participation in the labor market as such. And this is just one reason among many others, but all of these can actually be attributed to the patriarchal norms, which suggest that men are to be the breadwinners of the households of the family, while and they are to be paid the family wage, while women are supposed to take care of the household and the caregiving activities. Jyoti Ghosh, she argues that herein capitalism uses the patriarchal norms, an argument that has also been made by Heidi Hartman, and to effectively further their own objective of profit maximization through greater surplus extraction. And how do they do this? So this is often done through piece rated work, much of which is actually done by women. And we know that piece rated work is a casual form of work which requires lower necessary labor time, ensures higher intensity of labor. And this piece rated work, particularly this form of work, serves the interest of both capital and patriarchy because it is casualized. It enables the capital to extract more surplus labor, and it also maintains patriarchy because the women are doing their work within the household premises. And then there are other ways in which capitalism uses patriarchal norms like vertical discrimination and horizontal discrimination. Often, the reasoning that is provided for paying lower wages to women is based on the fact that she is dependent on the man in the in her family. So so she is basically a supplementary earner. So she does not require equal wages, and that prevents any upward mobility of women workers as such. So these discriminatory practices, they ensure that capitalists extract higher surplus value extraction, and this also maintains patriarchy because when you pay lower wages to them or when you restrict women within the household premises, it also reinforces patriarchal norms. Now, what do we see how the situation is during the pandemic in India? Now, before even the pandemic hit the country, India has been performing pretty poorly with respect to lower GDP growth rates. There was higher casualization of the workforce. Also, the share of wages in the value added had been declining over time. And then the pandemic hit, and we have the UN report which states that economic distresses are often observed to impact women and children the most. And they cite the example of Ebola virus outbreak in Africa, where the women, it was observed that there was a prolonged dip in the female labor force participation over there. Now, in India, what we see, there are quite a few studies that have come up reporting on the impact of pandemic on women, and we see that there has been a severe cut in the incomes of the informal women workers. They are the street vendors and the domestic workers. They are the workers who have the most precarious kind of work. And self-employed women also have lost their livelihoods. Even the health workers, who majority of whom are women, we are not talking about the doctors and the highly skilled ones, the ones which are lower skilled, and that is mostly overrepresented by women. Even though they have been able to retain their jobs, They have not been given their due payments. Moreover, working women are faced with this intensification of double burden, which we know is that they have to take care of both paid work and unpaid work at home. And there have also been notable increases in the incidences of domestic violence. So, given this context, what we try to attempt is to analyze how the interplay of both capitalism and patriarchy during the pandemic is likely to impact the female labor force participation, or FLFP, and how the inter-household dynamics might change in such a in a post-pandemic scenario. And we do this by proposing possible scenarios that might arise, and we cover both formal and informal women workers. And however, we do restrict ourselves to only married women, which sort of makes sense to us because in India, around 80% of the women belonging to the working age group, they are married. So we just restrict our analysis to that to them. Now, coming to the analytical framework, the Marxist feminist theory has been applied to understand how each of these scenarios, I talked about how possible, we are proposing possible scenarios that might arise with regard to female labor force participation in intra-household dynamics, right? So we apply the Marxist feminist theory to understand how each of these scenarios will influence the process of surplus value extraction. And in this context, we know that in the 1970s and 80s, there was this entire domestic labor debate that took place, and there was a lot of division and arguments among the scholars about whether domestic labor produces value or not, and even if it does produce value, whether it produces surplus value or not. Now, Hensman revisits this domestic labor debate in the 1970s, and she argues that domestic labor does create value in the Marxist sense because domestic labor is a part of the labor power of the commodity that is sold in the market. So, yes, maybe not directly, but indirectly, it is creating value. And although she argues that against the argument of Dalla Costa and James that domestic labor always creates surplus value, she does say that domestic labor may not always create surplus value, but it is theoretically possible for it to produce surplus value under certain scenarios, because given the power differences in marriages, and given the fact that domestic labor continues indefinitely, and given the fact that there is a care of, it's not only household duties, right, there is also the care of elderly and the children that needs to be undertaken. So a significant part of a labor is not compensated for. So it can be asserted that it is most commonly the case that the domestic labor performed by women in the household produces surplus value. And so this is also something which Heidi Hartman also argued, that women are actually exploited by both their husbands as well as the capitalists. And now we move over to the propositions regarding the post-pandemic FLFP. And let's talk about the women who were employed as informal workers in the pre-pandemic situation. As I have already said, there are reports that have stated that there have been a significant proportion of informal women workers who have been adversely impacted, mostly the domestic workers who have suffered a huge cut in their household incomes, the self-employed women who have lost their livelihoods. So what we see is that, or what we can expect to observe, is that there will be a surge of casual workers, right? And since the overall household income has declined, there will be this added worker effect, that is, there will be distress driven employment. Both women and children will be looking for work in order to compensate for the decline in the household income. And so this increased vulnerability of these women, these informal women workers, arises not only from their class position, because these informal workers, they form the working class, and but also their gender position. So when there is a surge of casual workers, there will be a swelling of the docile reserve army of labor. They do form the reserve army of labor, and then they are also docile. So it is advantageous to capitalists to hire them for lower wages, and that just enables them to extract greater surplus. So in the post-pandemic situation, there will be the interplay of both capitalism and patriarchy, we argue, and that will relegate the women informal workers to the lowest quality of jobs. That still exists now, but we argue that it will be worse then. How? Like the home-based women workers are likely to work at lower piece rates. Casual women workers may be employed at lower wage rates. And the greater the casualization, there will be greater exploitation and hence higher surplus value extraction. Now, let us talk about the women who were employed as formal workers in the pre-pandemic situation. And under them, we have two further categories. The first is the ones who retained their jobs during the pandemic, and the second is the ones who lost their jobs during the pandemic. So first, let's talk about the women who retained their jobs during the pandemic. So we have come up with this entirely new concept of working from home, and there are papers that talk about how this work from home actually comes along with longer working hours and more intensive work. So in the post-pandemic period, we might find that work from home is a new norm in workplaces. We are aware that some workplaces are actually calling back their employees, but work from home is still continuing in a lot of scenarios. And what we argue is that, and this is applicable to all formal workers as such, that the contracts and the working conditions of the employees will be adjusted along the lines of piece rate. And we predict a movement towards informalization of employment of formal workers, because with work from home, we find that there is greater monitoring and surveillance on the employees. And greater is the informalization of employment, greater will be the surplus value extracted. But while this holds in general for the formal workers, for women it is a bit more the situation is a bit more difficult, because the society still remains patriarchal and the wife is still solely responsible for domestic for household responsibilities and caregiving responsibilities. So what will happen is that since she has retained this her paid work, and she also has to continue her household work with all of the people living in the same place, there will be a reduction in leisure time, thereby a reduction in the necessary labor, and hence an increase in the surplus value extracted from her. And so we go back to the argument that was made by Hartman, that patriarchy and capitalism will be actually working simultaneously, which will reduce the value of labor power of women. It not only subsidizing, so not only the continuation of the subsidization of men's wages is taking place, it also reduces the value of the labor power of the women themselves. And this will happen not only on account of change in the nature of work, but also due to greater involvement of in unpaid household activities, because of the presence of all the household members within the within the premises. Now we move over to the category of women, formal women workers who lost their jobs during the pandemic. Now, it has been observed that there exists an inverse relationship, at least in the Indian context, between the engagement in household and allied activities and participation in paid economic activities. Secondary data analysis does show that as there was a dip in the female labor force participation rate in both rural and urban areas, there was an increase in the engagement of women in household activities. And no, I'm not talking about the activities that are expending expenditure saving in nature, but proper core household activities like taking care of children and the elderly and cooking and cleaning and the like. So we posit that the recent rise in the burden of household activities has a gender effect on unemployment. That is, women are more likely to either quit or be laid off. Now, what will happen in such scenarios? Say a case arises where the husband has lost his job during the pandemic, right? So both the wife and the husband has lost their jobs. Now, in such a scenario, both of them will be looking for a job, but but then the sequence of either of them getting hired is important over here. Now, if the husband gets the job first, the wife may or may not continue her job search, because household income, which is an important determinant of female labor force participation in India, it has been found that if the household income is sufficient, then the wife may refrain from participating in the labor market entirely. So it is expected of her to discontinue her job search altogether if the household incomes are enough. Conversely, it is expected of the husband to continue his job search even if the wife gets hired, because according to patriarchal norms, he is supposed to be the breadwinner of the family. Now, capitalism makes use of the patriarchal ideology to employ women for low skilled and low paying jobs. So, even if suppose the woman is only employed and not the husband, she might have, because she faces horizontal discrimination, vertical discrimination, she might have to work for higher number of hours, okay, or multiple jobs in order to compensate or to earn enough or sufficient household income. So there will, since there will be an increase in the overall number of working hours, we can say that there will be an increase in the absolute surplus value extraction. Accordingly, the wife will be producing both use value and exchange value, with her surplus value appropriated directly both by the capitalist employing her and the husband through her engagement in unpaid household activities. I'll stop here. Shatagri will take it up from here onwards.
Thank you, Annesha. I hope my screen is visible to all of you. So the second case that we'll be talking about is the case where the husband remains employed, and the need for looking for a job of a woman is lesser in this case because the primary breadwinner, so to speak, still has his job, and whether the wife will go back to the labor force depends on the relationship between the expected wage that she will bring back and the surplus value that is extracted from her within the household premises. And this decision will be taken by the family and not just by the woman herself. So if the expected wage is greater than the surplus value, she will be allowed to go back to her job. But because the need to get a job is less, she will still maintain her preferences of shorter distance from workplace, availabilities of creches, maternity benefits, and so on. But because in the post-pandemic situation, the job search will be high, her opportunities in the job market will be limited. If, however, in a situation where the expected wage is less than the surplus value, because of the predisposition that women's position as workers are secondary, she will not be allowed to get back to the job market, and she'll be responsible for production of only the use value within the household premises. Next, we move on to certain propositions regarding the intra-household dynamics. And for this section, we have broadly divided the women into formal workers and informal workers. And we propose certain broad scenarios which are likely to arise in the post-pandemic situation. For the female informal workers, we have already mentioned as to how the loss of livelihood are going to affect the female informal workers, and it is only likely that will in turn affect the intra-household dynamics. Because of the economic vulnerability of these families, there has been situation during the pandemic where child labor has been recorded. So ARA has done a study in Varanasi in Uttar Pradesh, and Majumdar has done a study in Howrah and Kolkata in West Bengal in India, where we have seen already the existence of child labor caused because of the pandemic and closure of the schools and so on. Because children form an important part of the docile labor force, capitalist system will extract higher surpluses from them, and they will be compelled to take up menial jobs. Girl children will be forced to work as domestic workers, either at their own homes or at somebody else's home. Moving on to another aspect of the intra-household dynamics is the domestic violence, which has been recorded as a way of exercising control over the partners. According to a report in 2011-12, at least 85% of women have reported violence inflicted by husbands regardless of their employment status. Initial reports have suggested during the pandemic that there have been increases in situations of domestic violence, and we posit that this is likely to increase post-pandemic within the household of female informal workers because of economic vulnerability and difficult working conditions that that will be brought about in the post-pandemic situation, as has been talked about before. So the female docility has already been understood as a shock absorber for the husband, and this ensures the psychological reproduction of labor power of the male worker. Now we move on to the intra-household dynamics of the female formal workers. Again, we divide them into some cases where the women quit their job search and those who have retained their job. For women who have quit their job search, now they exclusively work within the household premises. This intensifies the sexual division of labor, as was in the pre-COVID situation, pre-lockdown situation. In situations where domestic help is hired or the maid is hired, the domestic labor performed by the women can fall. And this is basically a movement of surplus extraction from an intra-class situation to an inter-class situation. And the exploitation of maids have often been, will operate generally through irregular working hours, low pay, sexual harassment. Again, this is because this is an informal work that the domestic maid perform within, in somebody else's household premises. The position of the women within the household can affect in two contradictory ways. Number one is that the bargaining power can fall because the bargaining power can fall because the women are unable to contribute to the household income. This may lead to an increase in domestic violence. And number two, because the women are conforming to the gender norms, that is, they're doing gender, this can increase their bargaining power. So these are two contradictory ways where the female bargaining power within the household premises can be affected in a situation when they quit their job search. In the next situation where women have either retained their jobs or have joined the workforce in the pre-pandemic, post-pandemic situation, we have further divided that into four sub-cases. If both husband and wife return to their designated workplace, we are back to the pre-COVID situation where women are responsible for the double burden, irrespective of whether domestic help is hired. In the second situation where the husband remains unemployed and in search of a job and the wife goes out to work, this is an interesting situation because this is basically a breakdown of the norm of a male breadwinner. So the woman is no longer financially dependent on her husband, and it may challenge his dominant position within the household. It has also been noted that there has been an increased male participation in household work during the pandemic. And because this is a challenge in the dominant position of husband, and this is a failure of the hegemonic masculinity, husband can resort to domestic violence in order to exert his position as the more powerful spouse. Case 3 is when the husband continues to work from home while the woman goes out to work. This is a change in the sexual nature of employment because going out to work is considered masculine and staying in for work is feminine. This is change in the sexual nature of employment, and there is a femininity in man's job and masculinity in woman's job. Again, this is a deviance from the typical norms that we have seen. This can lead to the husband to exert violence over his wife in order to compensate for his compromised masculinity. The last case that we'll be talking about is the situation where both husband and wife continue to work from home. There is no longer a clear demarcation of the workplace from the household, and the woman has to maintain a dual position within her household premises and at her workplace, and this can cause certain amount of friction within the household. I will not go through the summary again in the interest of time, but I think we have made some contribution in order to posit certain situations which are likely to arise in the post-pandemic situation in India. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to all of our speakers. Thank you very much to Satyaki and Annesha. Okay, so we have time for discussion, questions, debate, and so on. While we're waiting for questions to come through on YouTube, perhaps this is an opportunity for any of you to directly speak to each other or raise questions or issues that that were raised by each other's papers. So yes, please please go ahead, Nuno.
Okay, are you listening to me? Okay, so I have jotted, should I make first my remarks only to Jonas or both at the same time, to Jonas and to Annesha and Satyaki?
Yeah, you can do them both, one
Both.
after the other.
Okay. Okay, on Jonas, just a small correction that he did it himself. He says at some point that in Marx, labor and nature are both sources of value. This is blatantly wrong. Further on, he corrected it and he says that they are sources of use value. This is an important distinction, I believe. And only abstract labor produces value and surplus value, not concrete labor. So, but this idea that nature produces value is, I believe, from a Marxist standpoint, wrong. And he corrected a couple of sentences afterwards. But this was just a brief remark. I believe, honestly, you are still starting or in mid of your PhD. If I understood it correctly, you could clearly benefit from a dialogue with my colleague and friend at ISEG, Bruno Lamas, because he's doing and is close to finishing writing it. His PhD thesis basically is on the history of slavery, capital, and self-ownership / abstract labor. So I think it connects in many ways with many points of your presentation. In of course, connects in many ways, possibly with your PhD thesis. Another suggestion I would do to Jonas, and this, of course, is based on my preferences, namely on Robert Kurz's work and its importance or not. I believe it is important. There are 2 books from Kurz that unfortunately only exist in German and in Portuguese translation. There's no English translation so far. Shout out to HM if they want to, which are the Black Book of Capitalism, which basically is a critical history of capitalist modernity, and the World Order Wars, which basically is an analysis of imperialism in light of his theory, of the theory of the critique of value dissociation. Both these books, I believe it will be helpful to some extent. Of course, you would decide to what extent to your work. Okay, to Jonas, I only have these 3 brief remarks. To Annesha and Satyaki, what did I jot down here? Let me say. So basically, focusing on labor force participation, which is obviously a legitimate aspect and a valuable contribution as it was. I agreed with a lot of things they said, but raises a central issue, which I believe it was not addressed, or at least it was not addressed with the necessary emphasis. That is, of course, in capitalist society, non-wage laborers are for sure dominated and are in a bad situation because they cannot earn a living in capitalist society if they are not exploited. That is, if they don't sell their labor power. However, one should not forget, should keep in mind that according to Marx, wage labor itself and abstract labor as the substance of capital are insidious forms of social domination. Okay, so the possession of a job, although essential for the reproduction of an individual in capitalist society, is in itself a form of fetishism and a form of domination. Okay, I think this should be more clear in their presentation. And just to point out briefly that, as they mentioned, the thesis that domestic labor creates value and or surplus value is, of course, a highly controversial concept in the Marxist field. So I believe they are doing their PhD in both their PhD thesis. This needs to be, from my point of view, very well argued, okay, thoroughly argued, because this is a highly contentious concept, okay, and that's all I've got.
Okay, thank you, Nuno. Do either of the 2 other paper givers want to respond immediately, or do you want to respond a bit later?
I can start, although Well, first of all, thank you for the remark that I used value or instead of use value at a certain point. Of course, in Marx, value refers to exchange value in the circulation process. And of course, the reason why there's the differentiation made between value and use value is because Marx develops its thought about, I mean, value means the value for capital. So the value which is afterwards converted in monetary terms. But just to clarify, this has nothing to do with my PhD thesis, and I'm not doing any PhD thesis because I'm doctor by the time now, and has nothing to do with the team I've been presenting right now. My PhD thesis was about narratives on democracy in the Portuguese social conflict. I think, well, nothing much more to address at Nuno's remarks. First of all, this is a very preliminary paper, so it is very raw stuff still. It's maybe something that I want to think as a team in potentially a postdoc. And I think I mean it's something which I still need to think a lot of because it's a very challenging thing, as it's a very abstract reformulation, let's say, of our approach of these themes, because what usually happens when Marxist thinkers pick up the theme of gender or race, it's usually seen as things which are apart and then afterwards interconnected with the exploitation of labor. It's the same thing with the category of nature, for example, political ecology. It has been a lot of people have made a strict differentiation. I like, for example, Michel Levy as a very strict differentiation between both categories, and the idea of ecological questions is totally separated from labor as such. It has been changing recently, namely in John Bellamy Foster's book. Recently, he has gone back to the dialectical character of nature and labor. Also, Jason Moore has put the essence of dialectics in this, and I think that the way how Rosa Luxemburg pointed out to the importance of primary accumulation as a continuous process is a very interesting way how to enter this dialectic of both the continuous or apolitical political economy of the exchange process with political processes of domination and accumulation by disposition. This is, of course, a challenge to the paradigm itself of the initial or the pure process of the commodity form in Marx, because the commodity form in Marx, in a certain way, it takes all those processes apart. So the whole process of expanded accumulation actually is an abstraction, and it's the abstraction which is at the same time the depoliticized form of the liberal capitalist market. So as it is presented by capitalist political economy, What Marx does is a critique of this to get politics back in, to show how this depoliticized form actually is a disguise for politics. But Rosa Luxemburg goes further on in the sense that she integrates the spheres that are usually not integrated into the usual sphere of capitalist accumulation. So it's she shows how in the constitution of value and thus exchange value, actually the use values which are taken by violence, and thus not by the exchange process of other spheres besides the usual capital labor relationship, is an essential part in the value in the process of producing value. So I still have to think how to structure it within, but I think that actually Rosa Luxemburg, and this has been, of course, for the decades, been a discussion between Marxist economists and how they would integrate Luxemburg's critiques within Marx himself. Okay.
Thanks, Jonas. Annesha and Satyaki, do you want to come back now or later?
We don't. I mean, thank you for your question, Nuno. I think you raised, and I completely agree with the points that you have raised. I think the justification of the motivation behind considering domestic labor as value-producing labor probably needs to be argued more. But because of the interest of time, we did not go into a lot of details. We basically we followed Hensman's argument, and it has been argued a little more in our paper, but we did not go into that much. So yes, thank you for that. This is still a work in progress, and we'll try to incorporate more of that motivation in order to justify our grounds. Thank you for that.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions on the YouTube chat. One from A. Policino saying they would be curious to hear comments on cisnormativity and how binary notions of gender identity relate to Marxism and discussions around labor markets in general. I think that's a question to any of you. And then a question from Panayotis Sotiris for Nuno. How does the historicity of patriarchy, which precedes capitalism, and we assume Kurz and Schultz agree with that, how does that fit into their schema, the historicity of patriarchy? I had a few questions to abuse the chair. So firstly to Nuno, I mean, actually HM has already published critical pieces on Wert critique and the work of Kurz, and indeed we have another piece that's due to be published probably beginning of next year. But one of the issues with Kurz's work, and I'm curious to know if it's the same thing with Roswitha Scholz, is that they have an extremely annoying way of writing and engaging or not engaging with the general Marxist debates. They function something like a sect, an academic sect, who like to write extremely polemical dismissals of every other current of Marxism that exists without properly engaging with them a lot of the time. Whether that's, value form and other German Marxist currents, or indeed international Marxist currents. So it's extremely spiky and quite complicated to debate. So you're either a believer or not a believer. I think you're more of a believer, but it would be interesting to know whether Scholz is different from this in her work. does she properly engage with the other currents within the debates on Marxism and feminism? Does she debate with social reproduction theory? Does she engage with Lise Vogel's work? Does she engage with these kinds of currents, or does she just dismiss them or ignore them? Because there is something really, really irritating about the way that Kurz, at least, tends to reinvent the wheel and then announce his discoveries as if they are simply his own and not the product of a more broader Marxist debate. So yeah, that's my question to you. Is Scholz more in dialogue, or is she just issuing her truths from on high? My question to Jonas was, I mean, yeah, sure, Luxemburg is a good starting point for thinking about lots of things, but her theory of imperialism, very specifically, as you know, has come under enormous criticism from the very moment it was published, for good and bad reasons, but a lot of them were good reasons, by other Marxists in the Second International and then the Third International, and then later on in the post-war period. And the notion of primary accumulation or primitive accumulation, or whatever you want to call it, as a continuous process, has become very popular, as we know, in the last 10, 15 years, but has also come under criticism. That can be followed, for example, in the debate around David Harvey's book, The New Imperialism, that we had a special issue on historical materialism. There were at least a couple of very important pieces in there criticizing the idea of primary accumulation or accumulation by dispossession as this kind of one-size-fits-all analytical category. And then my question to Annesha and Satyaki is, you quote Hensman, Raheny Hensman's piece, I think the piece probably published in Historical Materialism. And indeed, you may be interested to know that we've published on the website, republished some of her other articles from the 1970s that were published in the discussion group she and Jairus Banerjee were in Bombay. So you can go to the HM website and see some of those pieces that we put back, we republished, put back in circulation on the website. But the other of your references are quite dated in terms of the Marxist-Feminist debate, you know, Heidi Hartmann and so on. And I'm surprised that you're not engaging with Lise Vogel's book, which is something we republished in the book series, the big wave of books about social reproduction theory and so on over the last 5 years, Tithi Bhattacharya and many others. So I'm curious why you took that route of sticking with the vast body of your references are references to texts from the 70s and early 80s, whereas there's been a big renewal in Marxist-Feminist theorizing since then. So, Nuno, you want to go first?
Okay. Maybe I will start by answering you because it will be a shorter answer. Okay, basically I disagree with pretty much everything you said on Kurz. That he doesn't dialogue with other currents, doesn't dialogue with other authors. On the contrary, on his work on imperialism, he debates profoundly the thesis of Art and Negri, for example, in Money Without Value, the last book he published while he was still alive. He engages critically at length with the Neue Marx-Lektur, Michael Heinrich, Backhaus, Reichelt, etc. So he engages with bourgeois social theory, Parsons, Foucault, etc. in numerous writings. So I think we are on a different level of depth knowledge of Kurz. I believe if you knew in more depth, you wouldn't say that. But okay, let's just disagree. In terms of schools, yes, there is kind of a, so to speak, there was, of course, Kurz has died since then, but there was kind of a division of labor in which schools within the crisis and the exit groups is the author that clearly explores more in detail the Marxist-Feminist issues, okay? So she engages with Frigo Ogg, with Nancy Fraser, with Regina Becker-Schmidt, etc., with a host of authors, as she also is developing her theory, which is much more detailed and much more satisfactory, if you want. Maybe I'm missing the word here, but that's not important, than Kurz's, because what Kurz's does in terms of the theory of value dissociation, and as I have mentioned in the introduction, is to appropriate and incorporate in his work Scholes' thesis. One may question, so why didn't you do your presentation about Scholes? Because this is based on part of my PhD thesis, and on my PhD thesis I only studied Kurz, Moishe Postone, and Jean-Marie Vincent. So although I know Scholes, this would have required me to reread a lot of stuff, and so that's why I basically, in terms of theory of value dissociation, you can get a lot from Kurz, but Scholes you can get more, and you can get that engagement with other Marxist feminists and non-Marxist feminist authors. I believe that answers your questions. Okay, regarding the question from Panagiotis Sotiris, I hope I'm spelling that well. Basically, yeah, he questions me about the historicity of patriarchy, right? Patriarchy precedes capitalism, so how does this fit in Kurz's theory, or what does Kurz make of it? Okay, to some extent, and as I've just said, Scholes is the author to go for in this matter, clearly. So she will have more to say than Kurz on this. But of course, modern patriarchy did not emerge ex nihilo, didn't start from the scratch, okay? We was able to build on pre-capitalist patriarchy. We are on the same page here, okay? Okay, but at the same time, this is Scholes and Kurz's theory, and at least my reading of it. At the same time, it fundamentally changes, okay, and was dialectically changed by it, okay. Both presuppose one another. If one can speak in Marxian terms, okay, historically, patriarchy precedes capitalism, but logically, once posited in modern society, okay, they both presuppose one another. And by doing so, the modern patriarchy has a lot more, is much more different from pre-capitalist patriarchy than what has in common with it, because it is interlocked, okay, with capitalist production, which simply did not exist in pre-modern society. So I don't know if this answers his question, but basically that's all I have to say. Okay, we need to think both in historical terms, but also in logical terms. My presentation was from a logical standpoint. Okay, once both capitalist production, capitalist reproduction, and modern, I emphasize modern patriarchy are posited, okay, in the Hegelian sense. But you're right, historically, patriarchy, of course, the same way as one could say that, and Marx does say it, that commercial capital, money capital, precedes historically capital, okay, but is not, it does not yet affect and encompass social reproduction as a whole. And once capital is posited and stands on its feet, okay, productive capital takes the upper hand, and financial capital and money capital and commercial capital become derivative forms. Okay, we can kind of make an analogy with this way of thinking. I believe. Okay, that was it. That's all I've got. Logic versus history. I think it's the key to unlock this question.
Okay, thank you. For those who are interested in following up the debate around Kurz, I recommend that you read the article that we published by Esther Leslie called Satanic Mills on Robert Kurz, which is an overview of his two books, Black Book of Capitalism and War for World Order. And that was published in which issue? It was published in 2014. Volume 22, issue 3 and 4. Okay, so Jonas.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Certainly something that I will have to develop further on if I continue to write on this theme. Of course, I know the polemic character of Luxemburg's theory on imperialism. I agree with some of the critiques, but on the other hand, I think we have to see as well where those critiques come from. I mean, one of the basic problems when it's appointed then that her theory is a one-size-fits-all phenomenon, where everything could be like it would be the general all, which is not the labor process. Everything else could be put into the primitive accumulation, and so it explains everything and nothing. The very big problem with, I think, most of those people that take that critique is that they have a very mechanical and very closed vision of a capital accumulation process. Normally, actually, I think that those critiques are very much linked with an idea of perfect predictability of capitalism and crisis theory. And that's the approach Luxembourgs brings actually takes the certainty of the prediction away. But at the same time, I think that a Marxist perspective on political economy should, first of all, always be a dialectical one, so not one which has prefixed schemas through which reality should adapt itself, and then instead of the other way around. Second thing is that Marxist analysis should always be a political weapon. So the reason why we have a political theory is to have a political economic perspective that can give rise to change. When we are analyzing today capitalism, it is very clear that we have a lot of social struggles which are clearly anti-capitalist or have an anti-capitalist potentiality, but which are not into the general framework, let's say, of expanded accumulation. So they're not the traditional industrial worker struggles. This means that struggles which have been with an anti-capitalist background or can have an anti-capitalist background, such as struggles for around the issues of climate change, the issues of female struggles, gender, and so on, the struggles against colonialism and racism. These struggles have an anti-capitalist potentiality, and they should get a framework. So any kind of political economic analysis of capitalism that is going to have passed the norm, let's say, of what is Marxist in the sphere. That's what is important is not to just analyze the world or capitalism, but to change it. A theory, Marxist theory, has to have this characteristic and does have to be able to incorporate in a value theory, and a value theory critique of capitalism has to be able to incorporate these dimensions. And that's what I say, that maybe the weakness of Luxemburg's theory is that this one size fits all can be a weakness, in that it would explain everything and nothing, but at the same time it gives at least the potentiality to incorporate those different struggles within a very Marxist framework, which is based on political economy, because that's something which is important in my view, because the way how it has been done before, or is mostly done, it's through the framework of Mouffe and Laclau, which would be a post-class form of articulation. So where the issues of where the issues of exploitation and violence are incorporated as accidental political articulations. Well, I think that these kind of things have to be integrated within an anti-capitalist and class-based critique of capitalism.
Okay, thanks, Jonas. If anybody's interested in following up the debate on David Harvey, at least, and his take on accumulation by dispossession, I strongly recommend you look at the special issue we produced, which is issue 14.4 in 2006. You might be particularly interested in the articles by Sam Ashman and Alex Kalinikos, Ben Fine, and Robert Brenner. Okay, so Annesha and Satyaki.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. Actually, there is no apparent reason as to why we just referred to dated works. It's just that we wanted to address the initiation of the debate in the first place. And over time, and we cited Hensman because we believe that, and we thought that it was more or less a good summary of the entire argument. Of course, she gave her own argument over there as well. So yes, we should have actually looked into more recent works, which we did not, and we will do that. Also, this is actually not a part of any of our thesis. So if you could just suggest some authors or some papers, as you have been suggesting, then it will be like very helpful. So to improve on our work. So we can incorporate more arguments on this particular debate because it's still ongoing. So
great. Okay, thanks. I think we've come to the end of our time. So thank you for participating in this session. I wanted to take the opportunity to remind you all that, of course, the conference continues throughout today. There is another session starting in 20 minutes, no, in an hour and 20 minutes. Marxism, Welfare and Care, with 3 papers there. And then we continue tomorrow, the session on Marxism and Culture at 12 o'clock GMT is cancelled, but otherwise we have panels throughout the day tomorrow, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and so on, up until the last session, which is on Sunday, a closing panel at 6 p.m. GMT on the fascist horizon, theoretical and political perspectives. I wanted to also encourage you all to take seriously the offers that were made at the beginning about subscribing to the journal and buying books from the book series, and also wanted to inform you about the importance of a new initiative that we've launched, which is our HM podcast, which the first number is out, first program is out, which is about the latest issue of Historical Materialism, which is a debate on political Marxism. So you can get details of that podcast on our website. It's available on Spotify and other platforms, and we will be doing a podcast for each issue of the journal that appears from now on, and then some sort of freestanding ones about books in the book series and other issues. Anyway, thanks very much to all four of you for participating in this session, and I hope to see some echoes of these papers in the journal and in future debates. So thanks very much, and good afternoon or good night.
Okay. Good afternoon.
Thank
Bye.
you.